we had a lot of success. The best what you could wish. But afterwards I said, well, nearly, I think a week or 2 weeks afterwards, I said, well, I've done it once. And I can't do it again because it took me more or less a year to get over it.
Really?
Yeah.
Johan Cruyff is remembered as the genius who changed football forever. But behind the brilliance was a ruthless side. Some players didn't just clash with him, they were shut out, humiliated, or even forced off the stage completely. Today, we're revealing 5 players Johan Cruyff simply couldn't stand, and the stories will shock you. Jan van Beveren was, by all accounts, one of the greatest goalkeepers Holland ever produced. Agile, commanding, and fearless, many believed he was destined to be the country's #1 for an entire generation. But his career at the very top was cut short, and Johan Cruyff was at the center of it. The feud began with something that might sound small on the surface: sponsorships. In the 1970s, the Dutch national team struck deals with Adidas, but Van Beveren was tied to Puma. Cruyff, of course, was also deeply involved in brand battles, most famously wearing his 2-striped Adidas alternative instead of the official 3 stripes. Instead of finding a compromise, the clash between personalities started to boil over. Van Beveren wasn't just standing his ground about a pair of boots, he was standing his ground against Johan Cruyff's influence, and that was a dangerous position to be in. Cruyff had enormous sway in the dressing room, and when he felt a player wasn't fully aligned with him, that player quickly became isolated. Van Beveren soon found himself in that exact position. According to teammates, Cruyff pushed for Jan Jongbloed, a less technically gifted keeper, to take over as the national team's #1. Why? Because Jongbloed followed instructions, kept quiet, and didn't challenge Cruyff's dominance. The results were brutal. Despite being at the peak of his ability, Van Beveren was dropped from the national setup in the lead-up to the 1974 World Cup, the very tournament where Cruyff's Dutch side became legends. Instead of being celebrated as the best goalkeeper in the world, Van Beveren watched his teammates write history without him. To add insult to injury, he was labeled a troublemaker, a tag that stuck with him for the rest of his career. This wasn't just a footballing decision, it was personal. Van Beveren himself admitted later that he felt betrayed, that Cruyff had used his power to push him out. And while Cruyff's camp denied outright sabotage, the message was clear. Nobody challenged Johan Cruyff and survived. The fallout was devastating. Van Beveren walked away from the national team altogether, his international career effectively over before it ever reached its true peak. To this day, Dutch fans debate whether Holland could have won the World Cup if Cruyff and Van Beveren had managed to coexist. Instead, the feud left one of Holland's most talented goalkeepers in the shadows, remembered more for the fight he lost than the saves he made. But Cruyff's sharp tongue and iron grip weren't reserved just for goalkeepers. If Jan van Beveren's feud with Cruyff was loud and public, Willy van der Kuylen's was the complete opposite, a cold war that simmered quietly but shaped Dutch football all the same. Van der Kuylen was a legend at PSV Eindhoven, a forward who scored more goals in the Dutch league than anyone else in history. His finishing was lethal, his consistency unmatched. But when it came to the national team, his story was one of constant frustration. And at the center of that frustration, Johan Cruyff. Cruyff was the undisputed leader of Ajax and the Dutch national side. His word carried weight, and his style defined total football. But players who weren't part of his inner circle often felt marginalized. Van der Kuylen was one of them. Despite his incredible numbers, he was frequently overlooked, underused, or pushed to the side. There was one moment that summed up his bitterness perfectly. After being called into the squad late, Van der Kuylen reportedly muttered, "Here come the kings of Spain." It was a jab at how Cruyff and his close allies seemed untouchable, almost like royalty, while players like him were treated as afterthoughts. The tension wasn't just about playing time, it was about respect. Van der Kuylen felt Cruyff saw him as an outsider, someone who would never truly belong to the Ajax-dominated core of the national team. And because Cruyff was so dominant, arguing against him was like arguing against gravity. In the end, Willy van der Kuylen walked away from international football, disillusioned and unfulfilled, despite being one of the most prolific scorers in Dutch history. His story is a reminder that Cruyff's power wasn't just about what happened on the pitch, it was about politics, influence, and who you sided with. And sometimes, the cost of standing outside his circle was an entire international career. But if Van der Kuylen's feud was fueled by silence and exclusion, Cruyff's clash with Edgar Davids decades later was explosive, public, and deeply controversial. By the 1990s, Cruyff had transitioned from player to coach and elder statesman. His influence was no smaller, but the game was changing, and so were the players. Enter Edgar Davids, fiery, fearless, and outspoken. He was the embodiment of a new generation, one that wasn't afraid to challenge authority, and that set him on a collision course with Johan Cruyff. The breaking point came in 1996, during Cruyff's second stint at Ajax. Davids, never shy about speaking his mind, accused Cruyff of favouring certain players. It was a direct challenge to Cruyff's authority, and the fallout was immediate. Reports say Cruyff responded with a remark that many saw as racially charged, suggesting Davids should remember his place. The comment triggered outrage. Some defended Cruyff, saying he meant it in the context of team hierarchy rather than skin colour. Others saw it as a moment when the great Johan Cruyff's old-school mindset collided with the multicultural reality of modern football. For Davids, the incident was personal. He felt disrespected, singled out, and betrayed. Their relationship never recovered, and while Davids went on to enjoy a brilliant career across Europe, at Juventus, Barcelona, and Inter, his time at Ajax under Cruyff ended with bitterness and controversy. The feud exposed something bigger than just a coach-player argument. It showed that Cruyff, for all his genius, could also be stubborn, dismissive, and unable to adapt when challenged by the next generation. For many, it was one of the rare times his brilliance was overshadowed by his flaws. And while Davids refused to back down, Cruyff had already shown throughout his life what happens when players cross him. He didn't forgive, and he didn't forget. But this wasn't the only time Cruyff clashed with strong personalities. In fact, his rivalry with another Dutch giant, Louis van Gaal, would spark one of the most famous philosophical battles in football history. Some rivalries are about money, others about ego, but the feud between Johan Cruyff and Louis van Gaal went deeper. It was about the very soul of football. Both men were Dutch, both obsessed with control, and both convinced their way was the only way. But while Cruyff was the visionary artist, favouring intuition, flair, and freedom, Van Gaal was the scientist, obsessed with structure, data, and discipline. Their personalities were like fire and ice, and every time they crossed paths, sparks flew. The clash began in the 1980s and grew louder in the 1990s when Van Gaal's Ajax team achieved massive success, including a Champions League win in 1995. Many saw Van Gaal's rise as a challenge to Cruyff's footballing legacy. Cruyff had laid the foundation, but Van Gaal was rewriting the rules, and he wasn't shy about saying so. The two traded barbs in the media for years. Cruyff dismissed Van Gaal's methods as robotic, too rigid to produce true artistry. Van Gaal fired back, accusing Cruyff of arrogance and hypocrisy. To the public, it became more than a feud. It was a civil war inside Dutch football. Fans and players were forced to pick sides. Cruyff's idealism or Van Gaal's pragmatism. The rivalry even spilled into Barcelona, where both men left their mark. Cruyff shaped the club in the early 90s with his famous Dream Team, while Van Gaal took over later with a more regimented approach. Even in Spain, the feud followed them as if their battle was too big to be contained in Holland alone. And though Van Gaal later admitted respect for Cruyff's brilliance, the feeling was rarely mutual. Cruyff never forgave him for daring to question his place at the top. It was a clash of titans, a duel of philosophies, and it left a scar on Dutch football that still divides fans today. But while Cruyff's rivalries with coaches were legendary, his biggest battles often came against entire institutions. And when Cruyff went to war with the Dutch Federation itself, players who sided against him paid the price. Johan Cruyff was never just a footballer, he was a revolutionary, and revolutions don't mix well with bureaucracy. Throughout his career, Cruyff clashed repeatedly with the KNVB, the Dutch Football Federation, over power, money, and control. And those battles didn't just hurt administrators, they spilled over onto the players who dared to oppose him. The most famous standoff came over Cruyff's refusal to fully commit to the national team unless certain conditions were met. He demanded more freedom, better treatment, and stronger influence over team decisions. The KNVB resisted, and Cruyff fired back with brutal honesty in the press. Players caught in the middle had to make a choice: back Cruyff or risk being branded disloyal. One by one, those who leaned toward the federation found themselves marginalized. Goalkeepers like Jan van Beveren and strikers like Willy van der Kuylen, both already on the outside, became casualties of this larger power struggle. The message was clear: if you weren't with Cruyff, you were against him. Even after his playing days, the war continued. When Cruyff was in line to take over the Dutch national team as coach, his relationship with the KNVB collapsed again. He walked away, never managing the Oranje because he refused to compromise. And the federation, just as stubborn, refused to bend. The cost? A generation of Dutch players missed out on what could have been another golden era under his leadership. For Cruyff, it was never just about tactics or lineups. It was about principle, and his principles came first, even if that meant careers were shattered in the process. He believed he was fighting for the future of football itself. But for the players caught in the crossfire, it often meant fewer caps, lost opportunities, and reputations forever tied to the wrong side of history. Cruyff once said, "Football is simple, but the hardest thing is to play simple football." Yet when it came to relationships, nothing was ever simple. His genius gave us beauty, but his battles left scars, and some players never recovered. Johan Cruyff is celebrated as the father of modern football, a genius who shaped the way the game is played today. But behind that brilliance was a ruthless streak. Jan van Beveren's career was cut short. Willy van der Kuylen walked away disillusioned, Edgar Davids clashed in explosive fashion, and Louis van Gaal found himself locked in a philosophical war that split Dutch football in two. Even entire institutions like the KNVB weren't spared, and the players who sided against Cruyff often paid the price. It's a reminder that greatness often comes with shadows. Cruyff's vision changed football forever, but his influence also left behind broken relationships and bitter rivalries. Some say that was the cost of genius. Others believe it showed a darker side he could never quite escape. So the question is this: was Cruyff protecting the purity of his footballing vision, or was he simply too stubborn to share the spotlight? Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. What do you think? Was Johan Cruyff a genius with flaws, or a flawed genius who just happened to change the world? Let me know in the comments, because this debate is far from over.